a warm welcome to those who are new. As was mentioned, we felt like as we gather weekly throughout this particular fall season, God wanted us to kind of come back and just engage and hear Him speak to us afresh about the things He spoke into this movement, many of which He speaks into the church at large, not just the Vineyard movement of churches. But there are things He uniquely did speak into who we are. And so these become core values. They kind of what God began, the things that we want to be certainly faithful to. And one of those things is His heart for the poor and to what it means to have compassionate ministry. And more recently, the Vineyard movement of churches has kind of made a fresh way of stating their values. And they state this about compassionate ministry. It says, we lean towards the lost, the poor, the outcast, and the outsider with compassion, with the compassion of Jesus as sinners whose only standing before God is utterly dependent on the mercy of God. This mercy can only be truly received inasmuch as we are willing to give it away. You hear in that statement something of wanting to keep at the heartbeat of ourselves the sense that Jesus said, really, God meets us all in mercy. And so we need to learn to be people who extend mercy, who give mercy. And there's a deep connection there. And so we want to be a people who have compassion beyond mere merits of others, but also in ways that are just merciful and undeserved to others. And particularly for those that are vulnerable and in need. And so it was that early on in the Vineyard movement, throughout moments of those early and emerging years, John Wimber, who served as really the father of that of our movement of churches, and whose heart so many felt drawn towards, would bring us back by something deep in himself, and it would be this: remember the poor. Remember the poor. It's something that God just continued to draw John back to as early on, and when he was just starting to follow Jesus, he was, part of the musical scene and kind of left all that, and God was drawing him out. And one night he just called his wife and he said, if we ever pastor a church again, we are going to remember the poor. Just God continually would bring him back. So he would kind of draw us back, realizing, John did, that somehow we don't remember. Somehow the church, which we might think, traditionally has always been rooted in the heart of God for the poor, but so often found itself in tensions. And historically, the American church in particular maybe has gone through reactions and actions that have made that hard. Kind of the more conservative or fundamentalist side of kind of evangelical tradition sometimes was reacting to kind of the liberal church, which said, it's really all just about a social gospel and justice and not really about God in His reality. And so there was a reaction whether we don't want to get lost into this social side of the gospel or this issues of social causes. And then, there was times in which that would get renewed by some, but usually it would be short-lived, and a lot of things would begin to get focused once again on seeing us experience God and not think of others. And I think John understood, and this is the fundamental reason that we have to hear it, is that he understood that it's very easy for us to say, I want God for what He can do for me, and it kind of gets lost to that. And we might say, I'm pursuing God, but we're really pursuing kind of God for ourselves. And there's something much wider. What I think John understood, and what we need to grasp, is that you can't separate the power of God from the heart of God. You can't separate this pursuit of the power of God. Yes, I want God to come and minister and move, but without really saying, well, I need, though, to connect deeply to the heart of God. And so it is that John understood how we could do that, and so he spoke into that and into us. And one of the things John wrote was this: that the same Lord who gives sight to the blind and creates miracles through our hands is the very one who feeds the hungry through our hands and watches over the immigrant. We must never ignore the poor and needy. We must never spend any outpouring of God's Spirit merely on ourselves. If we ever ignore the poor and needy, we are as good as dead as a people. Strong words, but they are words that I think if we really understood what Jesus taught at times, they bear listening to, that we really can miss the heart of God, if we don't hear his heart for the poor and our relationship to one another and those in need and the places of mercy. And so those words he would call out, remember the poor, they actually come from a very wonderful point in the Scriptures. And it's the point in which some of you who are familiar with kind of what happened as Jesus was risen and how his followers went into the world, you might remember that much of the rest of the New Testament writings are written by the Apostle Paul, who was originally known as this religious leader named Saul. And Saul was against Jesus and tried to come against his people, threatened as he was as a religious leader, thinking that this was too much of a new thing of God, and he would hold control of the religious element. And so God confronted him, knocks him off his donkey. He's blind for 3 days. He has this incredible awakening that, oh my gosh, this is God. And he gives himself to it. And he is this religious Jew, this leader of the religious groups, ends up having God draw him to go out to the Gentiles. Now, it's hard for us to appreciate that because most of us are Gentiles and we don't live in first century, but this was a big deal. So out he goes. Well, now it's been about 14 years and he's been out doing this and leading the way to bring the good news of God's mercy through Christ to the Gentiles. Well, what about those first followers? What were they to think of him? And this would eventually lead to them having this big gathering together in the city of Jerusalem. And as they gathered, they talked about these things and what God was doing. And the first disciples, the leaders of the church, the apostles, realized God was coming to expand to the whole world, to reach the whole world. And that Paul was sharing this mission, in fact, leading the mission to the Gentiles. So at the end of this, they release him and they say, go, lead the way. Lead the way to the Gentile world, which is a good thing because many of us in this room, most of us in this room are here because of that. Except for one thing, one statement. And we read it in Galatians as he's sharing this. And there it says, he says, all they asked was that we should continue to remember the poor, the very thing I was eager to do. In other words, they said, go, you lead the way. We trust you. You have this good news. Only this. One thing, though, don't forget the poor. And he says, and I already had that in my heart, and away he led. And I think in that short little phrase, we hear something of what we need to hear of God's heart. First of all, it says, all they asked, which tells us something about the centrality or the priority of compassion. This was so simple. This is the key thing. They could have said so many things. For a lot of us, we might think, compassion for the poor, or remembering the poor, caring, that's a good thing. It's not the central thing, but it's a good thing. It's an optional thing. But it wasn't for them. It didn't say, hey, if you have time, you might want to think about the poor. It's not a big deal. God doesn't care. No, all we have. This is critical. This is central to them. This is central to them. Remember the poor. This is vital. And the truth is, we see this throughout the Scriptures. In fact, if we'd be open to it, really, this is running through the very heartbeat of God from the very beginning. God begins to shape people to himself, and you might read through and think, gosh, all this history of Israel has some weird stuff in it. A lot of laws, a lot of commands about how they should live and how they should form themselves as a community. Most of those were about God trying to protect the vulnerable. And so he would speak to them and say, you need to relate to the foreigners that come into your land in the right way. You have widows and orphans among you. You must provide for those who are hungry, for those who are without. And so many of these things were about God's, what I would use the term, protective priority for the poor and the vulnerable. This protective priority. And why is that? What is it in God that looks upon or leans, as we say, towards the poor? Lots of ways we might answer it, lots of things that might come to mind for you, but I think one of the things at the core is that everyone matters to God. We say everybody matters, but it can be a little empty for us because we think we matter more or certain people matter more. God knows our disposition. Our disposition is to think that somehow if we've been blessed and we have more, that we're smarter, more successful, and somehow we think that certain people matter more. And God knew that somehow cultures would constantly think those who had health and wealth were more blessed. And kind of look down upon, if you will, those who may not be. And so we constantly see God just breaking that part or confronting that part of us. And I still feel it. I still feel like somehow if I am doing better in terms of money or in health, that somehow I feel more blessed, like somehow I'm more right, when it's not quite that simple at all. But it just happens. So God constantly comes to that and says, but everybody matters. There's this great value because God, everybody bears the image of God. And we need to hear that pressing in, that God realizes we don't see one another the way he does. We might look upon someone and have pity, but let me tell you something. Pity is not compassion. Pity is what you do when you feel superior and you look and you see someone and they're kind of in a bad way. And you kind of go, gosh, that's too bad. I wonder if I should help them. That's not even quite compassion. It comes close to it. It might be the beginning. But somewhere we have to see that people really are equal. And that we really have, and here's the key word, a responsibility. And that's what God was trying to bring to bear upon people. You have a responsibility for one another as created equal and with great value. And I think this beckons to us that there is this priority that must draw us out. The scriptures draw us out beyond some of the politics, if you will, of social issues and economic issues and justice issues. There's somewhere we need to value the politics, but it is not the end, and it cannot really define our sense of compassion. And I think for those of us some of us don't get very involved in political positions or ideals, but some of us do, and I think it's important for us to know that compassion is not defined as quickly by your politics as we might want to think. And this draws us out from both sides, I think, of what we traditionally have. Whether it's kind of liberal ideas and that might be towards, we need to redistribute wealth and we need to see government programs provide. Those can be good things to a degree. They have their limits. And there's limits if they do not realize, though, that in doing so we might strip the dignity of people. We might not be helping them to become really equals or really responsible for their lives. And so there's challenges. The scriptures see both. And then you might say over on the conservative positions on economics where it's kind of, hey, if we just kind of let people, everybody has an equal opportunity, and if you just let wealth kind of rise and build, then everybody does better. There's truth to it, but if you ignore, as the scriptures say, our human disposition for greed, you will not realize the issues of justice that are involved. If you just let human beings in their free reign, yes, they will create and they might provide in part, but greed will not always work that. We have to address greed, unfair, unjust systems. And so both sides have something to learn by hearing what God is saying in terms of remembering the poor. The truth is, the scriptures reach out to us and they say, you need to be responsible for your work and your part and your participation in providing. But you also need to care about the welfare of others. Both of those. And those are two things that often get lost. We do well to hear these things and to hear the centrality of this call that God has, always had, as a priority to care for those in need. And I think, secondly, the great value we have in terms of wealth, the priority, is because we're all poor. And that's one of the things that Jesus seems to make very clear about why we need the poor. Remember, he said that you all need the poor. The poor will always be here. There will always be an issue of poverty. Why? Because our whole condition has an element of poverty, and we all need to recognize it. And I think throughout most of human history, only a few kings and queens could probably protect themselves, from that fundamental vulnerability and dependence in life, and they could try to do that. Nowadays, I'd say nearly every one of us as a Westerner, even if we feel a bit stretched and a bit, tension over our financial needs, the truth is most of us have enough wealth, and we're the first people to ever live who did, who are able to have the illusion of control over this world. We can have a sense of, I kind of control my security. I kind of control even my health. I kind of control my health if I just manage it right. We have enough wealth to give us the illusion that we're in control, when in truth, we're all poor, we're all dependent. And at some point in life, and I've seen this among many people who have been very successful in life, the illusion of control will come away and realize that not even that wealth can keep us from the fact that we are at some level poor and dependent and vulnerable, and we really need God to meet us there. And so we all need that. As John Wimberwood said, we need the poor as much as they need us. There's a sense in which we're as we get close to those who are in need, we actually identify that we too are in that same place. And so there's this need, this priority among us. And so it has been within the vineyard throughout this time, this high place of priority. In fact, some would say prophetically the vineyard movement was defined as worship and compassion, these two things coming together. And the truth is they do flow together. Our heart to engage God and lift him up, and then the heart to let him fill us with compassion. If we read through the scriptures, we find in Hebrews where, I love this statement in Hebrews 13 where the writer says, with Jesus' help, let us continually do these two things. Let us lift our sacrifice of praise to God by proclaiming the glory, that is the goodness of his name. He is the great one. It's not just his name, it's his whole nature. His nature is what is really good. And let's announce it. And then it says, don't forget to do good and to share what you have with those, what? In need. For such sacrifices are pleasing to whom? To God. It all really combines. Did you catch those two things? Kind of lift up God's goodness and then receive his heart and be a person who lives that out. I like how the vineyard in the United Kingdom, they kind of declared it this way. They said, when the Holy Spirit comes through worship, he often leaves a deposit of compassion in the church. We express his heart of mercy and his demand for justice to a broken world. That is why so much of the social justice work done in this country emanates from the church. And that's a beautiful statement, and it's very true. I know a lot of people are very cynical and say, gosh, the church looks like hypocrites. They're involved in their own money. I don't see the church as really being a generous people. But in truth, if in the longer picture of history, and still in much of the world today, nearly every hospital among the poor was established by people who gave because they believed that's what Jesus was doing, caring for the poor. Nearly all the schools that were there for that reason. So many clinics, so many things are going on. There really is this movement. And I've seen the vineyard try to take this to heart and say, we will never leave this. We will never lose this. We need to do this collectively. And so some of you might remember when Katrina took place, this horrible devastation in New Orleans. Probably left more people than any other time without home, just overnight like that. And actually hundreds of vineyards came together as somebody led the way and just said, hey, do you want to send a team? Hundreds of people came out, thousands, not over a few weeks, but over a few years. Teams would come from various vineyards, people giving their time, people giving their vacation time, people giving their money, paying for it themselves to go and to help and to serve. The same unfolded when the earthquake in Haiti took place. So often, collectively, vineyards have come together. Collectively, we've given to some of those disasters over $2 million that people have given who don't have much. So it's a wonderful sense of that collective. But also every local church really is ultimately saying, what, Jesus, do you want us to do? How can we be your heart? How can we take to heart those who might feel vulnerable and be hurting? Last Saturday evening, I had a chance to go out and meet with some people exploring to help with some new ideas towards some plants. And I met the pastor of the Glendora Vineyard, which if you know where Glendora is, it's the farthest from us. It's the far east end of the LA County area. And I discovered in this smaller vineyard that this church had really taken to heart the issue and the needs of foster kids. And so they actually now have over half of the children in their church are all adopted, which is really a beautiful thing. But he said, gosh, and then God kind of led us to realize that through the process we went through, we started to discover how many of the social workers who work for Department of Child and Family Services were actually just at their end. They're just emotionally drained. And so often the Christians have looked upon, the government institutions like that in only a negative light. But he saw that they're trying to carry good things. So he says at one point when I realized 2 of them were on leave just of emotional stress, that we just went to them and found out they were right nearby, the main building that serves the whole. So we went to them and said, hey, could we in any way as a church, serve you guys? Yes. He said they just said yes without even asking more. And he said he was really surprised. I was surprised that they would allow. Yes. What would you like to? Well, we noticed that the rooms here that the children are brought to, when they are taken away from a family, they're just left in these white rooms that are just really tragically depressing, really bad, institutional. Could we come and remodel the rooms? Yeah. They let them come and remodel the rooms, make them beautiful, create interactive stuff. Then they realize that a lot of the children are there all day for 1 or more days, all day, while a social worker next to them is on the phone trying to find somebody to place the child with. Sometimes they're just infants, all day by themselves. He said, could we come and hold the little ones? Could we come to your teenagers and play with them? Yes. Just get some fingerprinting, some simple stuff? Yes. And that's what they're doing. I think it's wonderful. Every local church needs to find this. You heard Sarah share earlier about Harvest Home, and something God just drew us to be a part of from the very beginning. We were actually doing some similar work here, and we've joined into what Harvest Home is about for women in crisis pregnancy. But we could go through about 16 different things, and those who are making lunches for those who would be hungry today because they're without home. And we could think of so many different things in terms of the children that are in the area that we just felt, how could we serve those who might be second-generation immigrants, and parents may not be able to help lift the kids succeed, but they have a heart for their kids. So that's what the Learning Zone's about, and the free movie nights. How can we meet those? And so it's so wonderful to see how we've held that, but I've learned something that always comes back to me, which is, whatever we do collectively does not answer the question whether I have compassion. I can participate in it, and that's helpful, but what about personally? Where is my heart of compassion? So I want us to consider the role that plays. We can easily forget. So it says here, not only all we ask, but continue. All we ask is that you continue. Why continue? Because we can forget. Why continue? Because we can forget. How easy it is to forget these things, to lose them, to find ourselves somehow getting detached as time goes on. We live in a culture that I think creates a lot of distance and detachment for us, kind of a screen from compassion. Most of the human life used to look at a person in need and they were their neighbor, they were their neighbor on the same path. My neighbor's hungry. It's that simple. I have to look at my neighbor. We don't. We have now created a culture where we live is often kind of separated from. We can withdraw into where we live and really never engage people face to face, heart to heart, life on life as much. And that distance is dangerous for compassion. But that's only one thing. There's lots of things. We also are one of the only nations that has as many government programs, however limited. They do provide much, and so we can say, well, it's the government. I mean, it's not really about me. It's about, how I vote. But voting is not compassion. It can be an expression of it, but it's not compassion. But we can think it is. I'm done. I voted for the right people. They run the programs. And we become proud in a very false way, I think. There's also the sense of how social media can allow me to kind of identify with things, even when I'm not really that involved in them, right? So you and I can find a great cause on Facebook and go, oh, I clicked like. I liked that cause. And then I feel good about liking that cause. It doesn't make me, in fact, I'm not a better person for clicking yet, but it makes me feel good. We've created that. So many and we have to realize, no, where am I in terms of seeing people? And that word continue. Continue to what? To remember. Continue to remember. We need to remember. We need to come back to these things. And when we think of the word remember, we might say, it's just kind of bringing to our mind. So if I see a news program on, and it's about some devastating need that's going on in the world, or a group of people, or a tragedy, I might say, I remembered that news program. It made me remember the poor. It's actually very possibly doing the opposite. Because what remember means from God's heart is that you take it into yourself, that you actually live differently because of it. So when God would say in the Scriptures, and the Hebrew word that was used to say remember, when he'd say remember the things I have done, he's saying stop living as if I didn't do those things. Live as if I did. Remember what I did in the past. That's what he meant. Live like you take it inside of yourself, and it changes the way you look and see and live. So when he says remember the poor, this idea at heart is become different. Take them in. The very idea that we're told about Jesus, who had compassion. We're told that Jesus, it says in Matthew, looked upon the crowds and had compassion on them. Because of he could see their need, and it moved him. And the word means it's really being moved within us. It's like moving the bowels of a person. It drove him. You felt it. You didn't feel separate. You didn't watch. It wasn't in the head. It was in your very being. And that's what you and I have to ask. Do I feel moved in my being? Do I remember? Do I take it in and become affected by that? Do I really feel that that person is, and here's the key thing, my responsibility? Because if you do, you will never walk away from a responsibility. It will affect you. And Jesus saw humanity, and it affected him. And we have to ask whether we can reach that point and whether we are. And it says that remember the poor, the focus of compassion. So who are the poor, and what really is it that, who is it we're really to serve? Well, the obvious answer is that the poor are those who don't have much material or monetary resources. And that's very true, but we need to kind of get past the simplicity of that. And I think most of us have some sense of that, that not having money is not really the totality of what means God's heart for the poor. The truth is that there is a greater dynamic, and it really is about, I think, the vulnerability one has in whatever culture they are. God looks to those he values who become vulnerable and have their dignity stripped and have their protection stripped. Again, he wants to raise them back up and restore their dignity, lift them up and protect them and care about them. He wants to change the message that they're experiencing to say, no, you do matter, and your protection is worthwhile. And that's why God would speak about the strangers and foreigners, not because they were necessarily monetarily poor. Some foreigners could move into the land of Israel and have been very wealthy, but what was going to happen? They had no rights. And once they had no rights, they could be exploited. So he's saying you really have to think about the foreigners and strangers. We see this today. And he talked about the widows and the orphans. Well, the widow might have had wealth, but what's going to happen to the widow now that her husband dies? The husband was usually the means by which one family would be able to engage the marketplace to buy and sell. And when the husband was out of that in a patriarchal society, she was very vulnerable to being exploited because she didn't really have the same strength and voice in the marketplace. You see what he's speaking? He's speaking about the things in which he sees us take advantage of one another rather than take responsibility for one another. And so he speaks into these things. And this is what we see Jesus doing as he comes and he starts to do what? Engage lepers. And they're like, whoa, why would you go to lepers? They're cursed. No, they're not. They're blessed. I will not relate to them as the cursed. Jesus says, I will relate to them as the blessed. He prays for them. He blesses them. He heals them. He brings the things of God to those who might have been those like having AIDS in our own culture. And then he goes to prostitutes. They're the morally kind of cast out. Oh, well, they're just one of them. And we can label somebody by their moral deeds and then detach ourselves from them. And that's what people did. She's a woman of ill, repute. And Jesus said, no, she's not. She's a child of God. And then you see Jesus come to a tax collector. He might have had a lot of wealth, but he was deemed, he's a sellout. He's one who's done such evil that he's no longer to ever be cared about by us. And Jesus goes to a tax collector. He's constantly breaking the walls by which we judge the other. And we see this constantly in him and how he took this up in himself. It is far beyond merely an issue of monetary. It is really for the heart for the least, the left out, and the lost. That's God's heart. Who are the least, the left out, and the lost? Mother Teresa would say this. Mother Teresa, who gave her whole life to the very poorest of the poor, monetarily poor, sick, on the streets of Calcutta. She looked to the Western culture, and she was the most prophetic and profound of anybody. You'd think it would all be about monetary, but listen to what Mother Teresa said to us to listen to. She said, let us not make the mistake of thinking that hunger is only for a piece of bread. The hunger of today is much greater. It is a hunger for love, to be wanted, to be cared for, to be somebody. The real question when you and I walk by someone who's poor, we look to those who might feel vulnerable, is are we helping them be somebody? By the way that we relate. She's right. And the truth is, I know a lot of people who are monetarily wealthy who have compassion for the poor, and I know a lot of people who are monetarily poor who are not merciful. It is not as simple about whether we have or have not. This is not like, if I don't have much money, I don't need to care because I don't know. It's the question of, do I have compassion? How do we cultivate this? How do we get close to the heart of God? How do we rebuild something we so easily forget? Well, I want to close with mentioning one story and the practical things Jesus notes from it. Because Jesus understood this as hard. So a guy comes to him once, a religious leader, and he says, Okay, so what am I really supposed to do? You know? And you know, when we ask that to God, sometimes we don't really want the answer. Well, this is a guy who didn't really want the answer. Right? He's this young religious leader. So what am I saying? You know, isn't it about, Jesus said, well, what are the great, love the Lord your God and love your neighbor. Yeah, good. You got that? Great. So the guy's like, okay, so let's just keep this philosophical. So who's my neighbor? And he goes into this whole thing, and Jesus says, you really want to hear what you need to do? You want to really get it? Let me tell you a story. And then he tells a story that we know is the story of the Good Samaritan. And it ends like this. Jesus replied with a story in verse 30. He says, a Jewish man was traveling on a trip from Jerusalem to Jericho. It's kind of a long, winding road through the hills. And he was attacked by bandits. They stripped him of his clothes, beat him up, and left him half dead beside the road. There's the vulnerability of what the world can do to anybody. By chance, a priest came along. But when he saw the man lying there, he did what? He crossed to the other side of the road and passed him by. Then a temple assistant walked over and looked at him lying there. But he also passed by on the other side. Then a despised Samaritan came along. Now, any Jewish audience would have said, oh, the Samaritans. They were those Jews who had moved into the land of Samaria and then intermarried, so they were deemed to have been kind of like half-breeds. They'd really sold themselves out. They were no longer really faithful, pure Jews anymore. So they were despised in that sense. So this would be like the villain of the story. So the villain comes along. And when he saw the man, he felt compassion for him. Going over to him, the Samaritan soothed his wounds with olive oil and wine and bandaged them. Then he put the man on his own donkey and took him to an inn where he took care of him. The next day he handed the innkeeper 2 silver coins, telling him, take care of this man. If his bill runs higher than this, I'll pay you the next time I'm here. Now, which of these 3 would you say was a neighbor to the man who was attacked by bandits? Jesus asked. The man replied, the one who showed him mercy. Then Jesus said, yes, now go and do the same. In that story, I think Jesus, in that little story, offers us so much about what's involved with us learning to cultivate and grow and develop compassion and those who care. And I'll just mention these rather quickly here. The first of those things, in this little story, Jesus describes how compassion involves individuals in real life. Compassion involves individuals in real life. You might think, I wouldn't want you to miss this, that the story should all be about the fact that Jesus goes, okay, so God rallies up a massive source funding project. And they take on, all poverty of the world. No, he says, let me tell you about a story. It's about one man on a road crossing paths with another man. And I want to tell you something. With Jesus, that's the way he lived. And that's what he invites us to do. It always comes down to something very personal in the basic affairs of life. That's where compassion begins. Now, Jesus was not against communal working. In fact, he called the community to be faithful. And communally, we have to be faithful. God called the people to give together towards things. And Jesus actually does commend it. He lives out of that tradition. When they gave their tithes were helping to provide for the needs within the community and beyond it. And Jesus commended that. Jesus lifted up a woman when he saw her what? Giving the last of what she had, into the communal coffers, into where they took their offering. So Jesus was not against our corporate giving. What he understands is this. It always, though, should start first in us, in that place of how you see the person you just walked by. It always comes down to that. There's always someone along our pathways who's vulnerable, who's been wounded. And I just want to ask you first, like for you, who's on your road? Who's on your road? Maybe it's a family member. You go, yeah, we kind of wrote them off. That Billy, he's kind of the black sheep, Maybe it's a family member that gets written off. Maybe it's just a friend, and, everybody wants to write the friend off. Let's just judge them. Let's kind of judge them and say, oh, I don't know about them. They've just messed up. They keep drinking. They keep whatever. And we lose a sense of what we need to communicate to them. Maybe it's just somebody you pass by on your way to work, on your way home. And you go, yeah, there's that woman she's always just in my door. She's always on the way to work. Who's in your pathway? Who's on your road? I just gave you a moment just to ponder that for a second. Maybe somebody comes to mind. And secondly, knowing that first that, compassion involves individuals in real life. We see that compassion involves seeing people as the objects of God's love. It really all has to do with how we see them. I want to tell you, if you get nothing, get that. How do I see people? That's where I got to wrestle. Because you notice what it says? These religious leaders came by, two of them, religious leader, religious assistant. They're the ones who should do good. And it says they, what? Didn't see him? No, they did see him. They saw him. And what did they do? Pass by the other side. Why? Because they saw someone they probably deemed unfit, unworthy. They're kind of messy. They don't have it together. They're kind of unclean. And if that's what we see, and if we're honest, we see a lot of people that way. And our problem is kind of the superiority. I'm not messed up like they are. That's almost what they did, and that's what we do. It has so much to do with how we see people. But it says the Samaritan, when he what? Saw him. He crossed the road. When he saw him, he crossed the road. He saw him in a different light. This is what Jesus has to do in us, has to do a work in us, is to kind of wear down and wash through that evil, insipid sense of superiority that we all have. And also that which judges someone as seen in the grime of their lives rather than in what's beneath it. Helmut Telix described it this way very beautifully. And you can follow this quote with me. It says, Jesus gained the power to love harlots, bullies, and ruffians. He was able to do this only because he saw through the filth and crust of degeneration. Because his eye caught the divine original, which is hidden in every way in every man. When Jesus loved a guilt-laden person and helped him, he saw in him an erring child of God. He saw in him a human being whom his Father loved and grieved over because he was going wrong. He saw him as God originally designed and meant him to be. And therefore, he saw through the surface layer of grime and dirt to the real man underneath. Jesus did not identify the person with his sin, but rather saw in this sin something alien. Something that really did not originally belong to him. Something that merely chained and mastered him, and from which he would free him and bring him back to his real self. Jesus was able to love men because he loved them right through the layer of mud. And that is something I need so deeply in my life. I need to be able to look and not be so much quick to say, I'm going to judge and define this person by their faults and their failures. But rather to be able to see that I need to be the one who sees and speaks and calls out. Not absolves from responsibility. Not says that people's addictions or whatever their struggles are not significant. But to say they're not the end. And to be able to reach past that. We've got to see people with that. With those eyes to see. Or we're never going to be able to bring the ministry of God to people. Thirdly, compassion involves crossing the road. You notice that what's wonderful is how the Samaritan himself, it says, he saw him and he crossed the road. See, I think the others thought, oh, you're not really on my road, but we are. They're on the same road, and he knew it. We're on the same road. We're in common ground. What's our tendency? We look at people and say, oh, they're so different. They're really, I don't even know how to relate to them. But the Samaritan, I think, realized we're on the same road. And you know that you and I are on the same road with a lot of people. We just don't know how to realize that. We need to cross like this Samaritan did, not merely the road, but the road of indifference, the road of separation, the road of superiority. We need to cross that road. We need to get across it. And he did. And what he realized that we need to realize is this truth. And that is that we know a lot more about each other than we think. We know the common desire to be valued, to be warm, to be clothed, to be fed, to be safe, to be loved, to know God. You know it, and you know that it exists in every other person. You have common ground. Every person you think, oh, they're just so different. I wouldn't know what to. They're racially different. They're from a really different background. Guess what? They want the same things you do. They want to be loved. They want to be known by God. They do. And we need to take that common ground like the Samaritan did, instead of those who were separating it up. And he took that common ground. And fourthly, we find that compassion involves taking time. It involves taking time. What's the number one challenge most of us have for feeling like we're very compassionate? Which is, I'm too busy. I wanted to help. Something in me would have prompted me, but I come up against not having the time, not feeling the freedom, because I got places to go. I got things I got to get to. Isn't it marvelous that Jesus doesn't leave that out of the story? It is at the heart of the whole story. They all have what? They're going somewhere. The whole story is that. They were on their way from this place to that. I love it because that's the way I feel. I'm always on my way somewhere when I run into a need. And what are the first to do? Oh, I got to get on. I got to scoot on. What does the Samaritan do? I love how Jesus does not answer the question and does not paint the picture that Samaritan said, I am going to forego all my responsibilities to take care of every need that this man has. That is not at all. Jesus is so clear. He actually seems to kind of bring it right out there. The Samaritan had things to get to. Did you notice that he leaves him with the innkeeper and gets back to what he needs to do? And then he says, I'll come back and take care of it. It's so clear that he had things to go to. He doesn't forego his schedule. He adjusts it, though. And that's really what I think we're invited to do. We don't forego our other responsibilities, but we can adjust them to the needs that are around us, to become human, to be saying that I have a responsibility not merely to the person I'm meeting with that serves my agendas, but I have a responsibility to the guy who's lying there in the street in between. And so do you. Our responsibility is not totally what we're going to, although we have that. And the Samaritan takes care of those needs. But we also have a responsibility to those who might be in need. And the same is true with our money. I have a responsibility to take care of my family and many other things, so I don't forego everything. But I also have a responsibility to others with what I do with what I have. And we have to meet those. And Jesus understands that so beautifully. It's such a great invitation to consider that if we just take a little bit of time, it can make a lot of difference. And lastly, and this is so valuable, I think that we realize that compassion does not necessarily involve or bring about reciprocation. I love this part of the story, how it ends, right? Don't you love the part where it ends and the man, is now healed from his wounds and he's been taken care of by this total stranger, and he throws a big party for him, and he thanks and pours out, all of his appreciation to this incredible man who took care of him. It doesn't end that way, doesn't it? It doesn't even seem like it ends. I want the ending. I want the end of the story, the feel-good part, where everybody's dancing at the end and having a big party, and, the poor man's family is thanking the Samaritan. It's not there, and it rarely is. Not like that, because it's really it begs that. But the truth is, we don't get to hear about how the Samaritan got appreciated. Because in the end of the day, it's not really about how somebody appreciates us. And that's hard because we all want to, if we sacrifice, we want people to notice it, and that's good. But the truth is, there's a bigger audience, an audience of one. It's God. And that's what the Scriptures understand. This is all about our relationship with God. And we think, well, am I really responsible for people? You're asking the wrong question. Your relationship with God depends on you being responsible for people. If you don't get this one, you're not getting this one. You cannot separate them. And that's what Jesus is trying to say. You can't love the Lord your God and love your neighbor. This isn't optional. These are bound together. We will be judged by how we bring those two together, he says. In Proverbs 19, it says, if you help the poor, you are lending to who? To the Lord, and he will repay you. He's like, oh, thank you. If one of you was to help my son, who's now, my oldest son is living away in Denver right now, and if he was in need and somebody helped him, I'd be like, man, what can I do? Thank you so much. Do you know how that's how God says? Thank you so much. You took care of my daughter when she was on the streets. You took care of my son when they went through a hard time, when their spouse left them, when their child, when you cared for somebody. Oh, thank you. My heart is so with you. They're so tied. Jesus said it this way. He said, I tell you the truth. Whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers of mine, you did for me. That's a powerful statement. It's hard for us to take it in. But he's saying, when you really care for one of these who bear my image and like they're my children, you're caring for me. There's this deep connection. And I know it's hard for us to always find a place for compassion. But my encouragement to you, and I'll close with this, my encouragement to you is to realize that when you cross the road, and that's hard to do sometimes, but when you and I cross the road in our giving, in our time, in our listening, in our words, and we engage somebody, we will invariably find that it's when we're closest to God. I remember the other day, and I don't often take the time, but I did. I stopped, and there was a guy who was saying, so let me go get you something to eat, and I come back out, I give him some food. It was just such a short moment. But what I realized is that moment in that day was the closest I felt to God the whole day. You show me someone who really opens their heart sincerely, deeply, not like so they feel good about themselves, because there's a lot of empty pride. Show me someone who really sincerely opens themselves up to the poor, and I'll show you someone who's a lot closer to God than they realize. They may not even say they believe. They're close to the heart of God. That's what Jesus said. Tell me about a time when you, and I know everyone in this room has had some really meaningful moments. Tell me about a time where you said, gosh, I stopped for someone, I helped somebody, I found this deep compassion in me. Tell me about that moment, and I'll tell you about one of the moments I am confident you felt closest to God. We spend so much time saying, I want to be close to God, and think that we can kind of ignore maybe compassion as being connected. They are at the root one and the same. Love God, love them. God says, remember the poor, because you are poor, and we're all in this together. It's one road. There was only one road in the story Jesus told, and we all need to be on that same road. Let's pray. Jesus, we come as those who, we hear your story, we hear your call, but some of us, we just want to thank you that you care. We thank you that you care for us. We thank you that you are one who, you crossed the ultimate road. When it says that the Samaritan came close, we think you came close to us. You left the heavens. You left the eternal realm, came into our earthly realm to be close to us, the created, who abandoned you, who tried to walk on our own. You came to us. Now fill us with a heart to go to others. We pray. Thank you. Thank you for your mercy. Thank you that we're not standing here saying, do I have the merits of your love? Because we don't really have the merits. But you came and met us in all of our undeservedness. You came and bore our shame and our separation on the cross. Thank you. Thank you that you meet us, not merely in justice, but you reach beyond justice with mercy. Fill us with a heart for the same. Free us. Some of us are just like, we're all into fairness. It's not fair. They deserve it. Just free us from that. Some of us, you just want to free us from our heads where we think that having the right position makes us the right people. And we know it's not true. Free us from that. Help us to be open to just really opening our own hearts to others. And lead us in the way in which we truly remember and embrace those in need, we pray. In Jesus' name, amen. And let's